Standard deviation, spreads of opinion, and intensities. So really what we're talking about are, statistically, we're talking about standard deviations, and then how we describe standard deviations in HS reports, between individual level reports, especially LSI and LWS, where we talk about the spread of the standard deviation in terms of being a spread of opinion, how consistent the feedback was in describing the focal participant, how narrow or wide that spread of opinion is. When we look at standard deviations in OCI and culture data, then we start describing them as intensities, referring to how intense the culture is in terms of the message that it's communicating to members. So let's have a look at standard deviation. So this is a graphic that we've been using for a while, and I really like to try to visually help people to capture and understand what is a standard deviation and why is it useful. So this is just a few different Likert scales where we're asking about effectiveness, and this would be across 3 different individuals. So in the first case, the little gray circles actually show the actual feedback response from each of the individual respondents providing feedback. So you can see those little gray dots. Then, as we do show in the report, we calculate and show the mean, which is shown with the little triangle, so the average score. And then we also calculate the standard deviation, which is essentially the average distance that each of these individuals falls from the mean itself. And that's typically in outcomes in our reports, that's depicted with these little red lines that extend 1 standard deviation above and below the mean. And I think that's very nice because it's sort of visual, and we can see that most of the responses must fall within that red line. And you can see as the responses become less consistent, more spread out, we may end up with, again, a very similar mean or average, but this is a very different kind of feedback than is this. And so it's nice to have not only the mean, but also the standard deviation to help us understand how consistent that feedback was, whether everyone describes me consistently in the same way, or whether there's a lot of variability in that description and opinion. So that's essentially what a standard deviation is. Moving forward, we're going to be talking about those standard deviations within the circumflex. So when we look at patterns, either psychological and behavioral patterns in individuals or cultural patterns in organizations, we're not only measuring those patterns, the extent to which we're behaving or the cultures and encouraging that style of behavior, but we're also looking at how consistent that feedback is. And that tells us something additional. So this slide, I'm trying to show standard deviations, give you a visual to refer to. So again, standard deviations, we use those in individual level tools and we call them spreads of opinion. And at the organizational level tools, we call these intensities. So I have to point out here right away that this is actually not standard deviations. These are what are called interquartile ranges. But in any case, they're very, very similar. And at least for visualizing what we're talking about, I think it's fair to use this graphic to show what we mean. So when we're talking about a narrow spread of opinion, higher levels of agreement, for example, the 12 o'clock style here, self-actualizing, could be somewhat of a good example of that. We can see the average score here, and then we can see somewhat the spread, and that spread is fairly narrow, at least when we compare across other populations and other styles. As compared to another style like humanistic encouraging, which again has a fairly similar mean or average, but a much wider spread of opinion. So in individual level tools, this would mean that if this is the feedback that I'm receiving as a focal participant, then people are much more clear and consistent in describing my self-actualizing behavior than they are in describing humanistic encouraging patterns. And really what that comes down to is I, as the focal participant, am likely using different extensions of this behavior with different groups. At least this is the most common explanation that we find for why there are differences of opinion. It generally has to do with the fact that the focal participant is honestly using different behaviors and different patterns of behaviors interacting with different groups. I'll get into that a little more in a moment. If we think about this kind of profile in terms of OCI data, then this self-actualizing is a more intense style than is the humanistic encouraging, which is less intense. That's important and different, because what this is telling you is that the organization is much clearer and more specific about the level of self-actualizing that is expected from members within the business, and that the organization is less clear and more variable in the extent to which it encourages, for example, humanistic encouraging behavior. In some parts of the business, people believe we're really expected to be quite humanistic encouraging. In other parts of the business, to a very different extent, that opinion may vary. So that, again, can tell us some other interesting information, and I'll come back to that. So in individual level tools, we call this the spread of opinion. So this is primarily LSI and LWS. Essentially what we're doing is taking the raw scores by style, calculating the standard deviation for each of those styles, and then applying that calculation, that standard deviation, to a norm. Just for the same reason that we need to apply the raw data to a norm in order to get an accurate percentile score, we also need to compare the standard deviations to a norm in order to get an accurate understanding of, is this really a narrow description, wide, or very wide? So sort of in the two extremes, we either end up with, let's say, feedback that's very narrow to narrow, even though I'm inviting different groups of people to give me feedback, peers and direct report groups. They're pretty similar in how they perceive me as an individual, and they're describing me in fairly consistent ways, and that's creating a small standard deviation and what's called a narrow spread of opinion. There's lots of agreement and consistency. The other option is that, honestly, I am interacting with different groups differently. I behave differently toward and with my peer group, perhaps, than I do toward direct reports. Therefore, there's a greater difference in terms of their perception of my behavior, and that plays out in terms of two somewhat different descriptions, leading to a wider spread of opinion based on a larger standard deviation. Hopefully that makes some sense. So this happens quite frequently. We see this all the time in LSI and LWS reports. And you can see this in the report. We actually tell you the extent to which each of the 12 styles in the feedback is either very narrow, narrow, average, wide, or very wide. A lot of times we get follow-up questions from consultants and participants about what does it mean when the spread of opinion is narrow versus when the spread of opinion is wide. One of the concerns oftentimes seems to be that the wider the spread of opinion, the larger the standard deviation, perhaps the less accurate the data is, because it seems to be less consistent. The accuracy of the instrument is actually, thankfully, not what we need to worry about. The instruments are designed to be very accurate, reliable, and valid. So when we get this kind of variability in description, it actually is typically representing truly variability in the focal participants' behavior. People are really interacting with different groups, typically in significantly different ways. And it's interesting.
May I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
I always look at the end of LSI, for example, when I have such a big spread or wide spread of opinions, to see how frequently the participant or the raters are meeting the participant, or how easy it was to describe.
Right,
because
exactly.
It might be the problem of the choice of the respondents. What do you think?
Yes, exactly. So there are a few things, and I have a few of them on the next page. There are a few things that we should think about in terms of why this is, benefits of this, consequences of this, that sort of thing. So yes, you're absolutely right. My understanding is that those two items in the back of LSI, how frequently do you come into contact with this person? How easy was it for you to describe this person, right? Those are sort of the items that in part are there in the case that we get. So if we get wide spreads of opinion, to be honest with you, the number one reason for that genuinely is that the focal participant is interacting with different groups differently.
Yes,
you can double check this, I think, by looking at the breakout profiles. Because if this is the case and they are behaving differently, then you'll get different profiles based on typically the different relationship groups, and those profiles will be different. Now, there is another option, meaning if we have wide spreads of opinion, and it's not the fact that the focal participant is really changing their behavior and interacting differently with different groups, the next most likely, I believe, explanation, but this is very rare, is that the people really don't come into contact with the focal participant frequently enough. They don't know them really well enough in order for them to answer the questions of the LSI. And so you get sort of unclear descriptions and somewhat variable data, and that can show up as a larger standard deviation. You can kind of catch that because firstly, if you go to the breakout profiles, you won't really get different profiles, if you see my point. You get sort of the same fuzzy profile across each group, because it's not that I'm interacting in this way with group A and differently with group B. It's that neither of these groups know me particularly well, and therefore their descriptions are variable, and therefore you tend not to find distinctly different profiles in the breakouts if that's the case. The other place to check it is exactly where you mentioned, in the how often do these people come into contact with the person, how easy was it for them to describe this person, and sort of double check that. Thankfully, that's, in my experience, very, very rare that we have to be concerned about the accuracy of the feedback, because one of the things we always talk about is that, right, we should be inviting and selecting respondents to give us feedback who've worked with us for at least 6 to 9 months, people who we work with. And we also stress, invite the people who you work with and come into contact with most frequently. It seems to be most of our clients do that. And we have people saying that I could describe this person, I work with them frequently. And then when we start seeing wide spreads of opinion, then it's definitely a time to look at those breakouts and start seeing what's happening differently with different groups. But you're right, that can be the next most likely thing to look at if we suspect that it isn't the focal participant's behavior itself, which in most cases it is.
I think it also happens sometimes that, very rarely, but it happens that someone is so much introvert that people get into contact quite frequently, but still they have some problems with describing that person.
And sometimes you can even get somewhat constricted profiles in that case, right? Where I just don't, I may spend some time with the person, but I don't really see them actively, working towards goals and sharing ideas. That sort of, also an important topic for people not to recognize those patterns. Okay. All right. So, good point. So a couple of things about these. One is, when we have narrow spreads of opinion and high levels of consistency, again, that typically is described or is very accurately reporting that this person is sort of consistent in their behavior and approach, regardless of whom they're interacting with. A lot of times consultants and coaches like this type of profile because we have clear development opportunities. If I'm not particularly achievement oriented, and that's consistently described by everyone, then maybe focusing on developing achievement is something that is a clear opportunity. It also sort of, in a way, simplifies some of the development actions, because we have clear styles we need to focus on, clear things we need to do that with everyone. So it can sort of simplify and clarify the development journey, steps, and process to some extent. Having said that, I also very much like these wide spreads of opinion, even though it typically means that the focal participant is interacting with and approaching other people or different groups of people quite differently. I always find that you can usually get some really interesting conversations and learnings out of this. The first point is it gives us an opportunity to ask the focal participant why those differences exist. Why do you use achievement-oriented behavior with this group, but not with that group? Or, what's going on there? I always find these to be some of the most interesting questions, because it really creates awareness in the focal participant when they start to realize that they can recognize that I do achievement-oriented, goal-oriented kind of things with these groups, but I don't do that with other groups. I hold back from doing that with my leader, whatever it may be. It really creates a lot of awareness in terms of how I'm interacting with other groups, how what I'm seeing in my experience with these groups has to do with the way that I interact with them. The other thing that it really points out, which I think is very nice and powerful, is that you as an individual can change. All of the HS tools are developmental instruments with the purpose of learning from them and creating change. Sometimes people use the tools and think that, that's just me. I can't do anything differently. But this is not personality. These are behavioral patterns, and we can change these things. And these profiles are sort of nice to illustrate that. You can be achievement oriented. You're doing it with that group. The question is, why aren't you doing it with other groups? And again, that really helps people to think through what those situations are, what's holding me back from behaving in ways that are consistent with the goals and that sort of thing, and to create that awareness. Again, one of the things I always talk about with reports is that before people can really use them effectively, they need to identify with the report. Like, they don't just need to see the profile, they need to see that the profile really represents them. And a lot of times these different profiles, people can see, that is how I interact with that group, and I do things differently with another group. And that's a very interesting way for them to start reflecting on why is that, and what are the consequences of that, and how am I choosing to do these different things? What's the justification behind that? So in any case, I find these can be really interesting to discuss with people when we do see those differences. And again, point out that you obviously can change. You're already doing it. Moving forward, we're just hoping for people to change in more conscious and intentional sorts of ways. Okay, so that's spread of opinion and with regard to the individual level tools. The next is to talk through the same concept of intensity in organizational level tools. So we do this both for OCI current and OCI ideal. Again, not only calculating the percentile scores of the profile, but calculating standard deviations, applying that standard deviation to a norm, and then providing that feedback in the report of whether that standard deviation represents a very high level of intensity, very high, moderate, low, or very low. So same sort of concept in terms of the consistency of the data, but telling us something a little bit different. So again, same sort of concept in organizations where we're not only describing the culture, but we're all describing the culture very similarly. That's showing that people have a similar perception of what is expected of them, and they're describing that pattern with consistency. Again, if we look at organizations and cultures where we have wider lower intensities, wider spread of descriptions, there's a greater disparity in terms of what people believe is expected of them. Some people in certain departments believe they're supposed to be perfectionistic. Other people in other departments really don't think that's how they should approach their work. And there's a greater variability in how people understand what's expected of them in organizations. So I usually talk about this in accreditation and oftentimes with clients as well, because I usually say that there are two things you typically don't want playing out in your organization's culture. The first thing you really don't want are defensive behavioral patterns that get in the way, hold people back, reduce productivity, and are inconsistent with values. The second thing that you really don't want in your culture are significant subcultures. Different patterns, different subcultures playing out within the organization that are inherently different from one another and potentially inconsistent with one another. Makes it very hard for organizations to work cohesively. You'll see this especially in siloing, which I've talked about quite a bit before. Different functional areas and divisions of the organization that really have created their own culture, and those cultures may be incompatible with one another. And then we get to a point where the business functions sort of vertically, but it doesn't function laterally. That's a consequence that we do find in organizational culture when we have very distinct subgroups playing out. There are different places where these kinds of differences in culture can play out. One of the points when we talk about inconsistency in OCI data or low intensities, so difference opinions. One thing that we talk about is the fact that typically is associated with inconsistent leadership and climate factors. So if you're familiar with the whole how culture works model, thinking of those climate factors that influence organizational culture. If the culture is variable and we have low intensities, then you typically find that climate factors are variable. In some parts of the organization, we punish any mistake people make. In other parts of the organization, we don't. In some places, we set unrealistic goals. In other places, we set very simple and straightforward and easy to achieve goals. Those kinds of structural climate differences lead and contribute to differences in culture. So you'll see that the most likely areas are hierarchical differences and functional areas where we design those systems differently within the organization, and the extent to which climate and leadership differ across the business predicts differences in subcultures and creates these kind of low intensity profiles. So consequences of this at the culture level, let's start at the high end here, very high. Similar things to what we talked about before. Sort of nice when working with an organization to have that consistency. It means people are very clear about what's going on. That opinion is shared widely in the business. It's sort of similar to LSI and individual tools that can make it a little clearer in terms of which styles we really need to focus on and pay attention to. And also it can be, those things can be linked to specific climate factors and are in some ways a little easier to develop. Having said that, while they're a little easier to sort of target and focus on because we know what needs to change, they can be more difficult to actually shift. Because if you think of what we're actually showing, we're showing that people within the organization have a very clear understanding of how much perfectionism, for example, is expected of them. For them to have that very narrow, clear understanding, there must be things going on, and that's again climate, that are sending the message to people pretty frequently and with consistency about what is expected. Those high intensity patterns then oftentimes are quite resistant to development and change, because you're asking people to do things differently along a pattern of behavior that they've been very sort of ingrained and encouraged and have a clear expectation about what's expected of them. By the way, that's one of the things down here that we notice is a reason for wider spreads of opinion, and that is, or wider, sorry, intensities, and that is development. So a lot of times if we're working with a client on a specific culture style and it's, perfectionism and it's very intense, a lot of times one of the first things we'll see before that perfectionism really reduces over time is the first thing you should see is that the standard deviations or the intensity starts to become wider. Meaning we used to all believe we need to be highly perfectionistic, but now as a function of this development, even though we haven't quite changed that opinion, we're starting to recognize that something different might be expected of us. Some of us are believing that a little less perfectionism is appropriate, and you start to get a little less consistency as people start to sort of change their minds and before that pattern really begins to shift. So that's another reason for it. Okay, down here when we talk about the wider spreads, again, some of these are similar to what I like to talk about at individual levels. So now you get to ask some interesting questions about why, when, and where are these differences happening? So when we talk about LSI, why are you using achievement with this group and not with that group? Why does it depend on when and where and with whom you're working? What's the reasoning behind that? We can ask similar questions when we look at OCI and culture profiles and data. When and why and where are these patterns playing out? That can be very helpful so that we can understand how do we encourage constructive behavior, because another really nice thing about this kind of variability is you'll be able to show that there are more constructive and more defensive subcultures within the organization. And that's extremely helpful, because as soon as we are able to provide reports to clients, not only can we show them what their culture is, but we can show them how people work and when their culture is more constructive, and how people work when their culture is more defensive. So we can sort of go through the business and find the most constructive subgroup and find that, lo and behold, that is the group with the highest level of satisfaction and engagement. They're the most effective. They have the highest customer service ratings. We can show the organization that where you have constructive patterns in your business, you have high performance. And where you have strong defensive patterns in your business, you have underperformance. And that helps to understand that, well, first of all, we can do this. Again, similar to the individual, You can create achievement-oriented, constructive culture in your business. You're already doing it. The problem is you're just doing it sort of here and here and here, and not everywhere. And a big opportunity there is to look at those groups where we do have constructive patterns and ask them, how are we doing this? When are we doing this? What's encouraging this? And then learn from that and apply that broader throughout the business. So that is a strength of actually that variability, is you can show the clients how this all plays out within their business when there are more or less constructive cultures playing out. The last point is, why this may happen, why we tend to see less consistency. So for individuals, as we already talked about, there are just a few reasons really with this kind of wide spread of opinion in individuals. Typically, again, the focal participant genuinely behaving differently toward different groups. Otherwise, it could be issues, as we pointed out, like, we've selected raters who don't know us particularly well and those sorts of things. Thankfully, that's very rare, but really that's it's got to be one of those two or three explanations. When we look at low intensities in organizational culture, there are actually a lot of reasons for them. So again, I already pointed out, anywhere where the climate differs in the organization, the culture is going to differ. So if you find really different cultures playing out, you should be looking for very different climate factors also playing out. Those things need to be aligned to the extent possible. And the other thing I would point out is it's also very strongly, of course, leadership led. So leadership tends to be the most influential factor in organizational climate. So if you can imagine, an organization with 20 leaders, each the head of their own division, each of them very autonomous, then the cultures of each of those 20 divisions becomes heavily influenced by the leader who's leading it. And to the extent that those leaders lead in inconsistent ways, creates inconsistencies within the cultures of those divisions and can lead to the kinds of challenges. So that's anywhere the climate is different is a reason where you're going to get that kind of differentiation and inconsistency. Other reasons are good things like restructuring. So that's another example of climate factors changing or differing. We used to have jobs designed in this way and goals were set this way. These were the things that were rewarded, but now our company's going through a whole huge restructuring and everything is changing. In that case, you can certainly expect to have less consistency in the data as people are literally learning what is expected of us now. How are we supposed to approach our work now? That kind of restructuring absolutely can affect the consistency and spread of opinion in the data. The other one, and probably the biggest one I've ever seen, is merger and acquisition cases. So, if you take two organizations with different cultures, sort of squeeze them together, but do not effectively incorporate those cultures, what you end up with is one organization with two cultures playing out within it. And those cultures will oftentimes exist and persist for quite a period of time. And that's the kind of situation where you can get really radical differences in opinion, where some people are describing the culture of company A, while others are describing the culture of company B. And you really get very, very different profiles. We've actually had clients do that, and in those projects, in many cases, we'll add demographics so that we can split the data and show people who were formerly with organization A versus B, and then you get oftentimes very different profiles with very narrow and intense spreads of opinion, or high levels of intensity. So sort of everybody from company A agrees very clearly what the culture is. Everybody from company B agrees very much what their culture is, but they are different. And when we push them all together, then you get these very low intensities, lots of confusion. And again, that's not particularly helpful or effective for organizations. The last one I've already pointed on just briefly, and that is development. The other reason that these spreads of opinion can become, or the intensities can become more variable, is that we're developing, we're doing things differently. A lot of times we've even seen this across hierarchical levels, where we'll go into an organization, look at the culture through the business, and then start by developing and focusing on the leadership levels and making changes there, and then cascading these changes down through the organization. And the first thing you should see are the standard deviations becoming larger, or the spread of opinion becoming wider. The first thing we're realizing is we're expected to do things differently here. And so the opinion starts to become more variable until we understand what the new expectation is, at which point it becomes once again consistent. So you can actually see this play out across organizations. The spread of opinion, or the intensity, becomes lower as that pattern of behavior is changing. And then ideally, as it's again reinforced and developed, then you get more and more agreement at the new level. So a variety of reasons for why we may see this at the organizational level, always interesting to look at. Usually we can figure out what it is, whether it's climate factors, leadership aspects, a merger and acquisition sort of situation, figure out where that's coming from and explain it. But again, at the end of the day, especially for organizational culture, we ideally want to create cultures that are not only constructive, but have high levels of intensity. They're constructive throughout the organization, top to bottom, and everyone working there has that shared, consistent mindset about what's expected of us, what is good work, how we should approach our tasks, how we should work with each other. All right, so that's intensities at the organizational level, spreads of opinions at the individual level. What they are, I hope, what that tells you when they're narrow or wide, and hopefully a little information on how we can use that.